You might have noticed these little devices on my toms, kick, and side snare. And if you aren't familiar with them, you might have wondered what they are. These are drum triggers. Triggers sense when you hit the drum, and that information can be used to do all kinds of stuff, usually triggering sounds through an external drum module, sometimes called a brain, or through computer software in your digital audio workstation. You can sync to devices like sequencers and drum machines and even lighting rigs. I mostly use the D-drum triggers because I like this metal housing. I like the small profile, and the XLR connection is on the bottom. But the actual guts in here, the sensor itself, really isn't that sturdy. I've gone through a ton of these things over the years. You can buy those with 2 elements so that you have a backup. But once one element goes, you should probably go ahead and buy a new trigger because the second element probably isn't too far behind. For the past few years, whenever one of my D drums has died, I've replaced it with a Simmons trigger. Mostly because I like the black housing. I think it looks nice on the big kit with the black shells and the black heads. The Simmons triggers are also a little less expensive, but they do come in a plastic housing. For the most part, for me, that hasn't been a problem because they are located on places on the kit where I'm not likely to hit them. And so, they worked pretty well, but they can only be attached to the drum at the lug screw, while the D-drum triggers can mount anywhere around the hoop. The Simmons triggers also have a bigger back end, and the 1/4-inch cable connection is on the side. So that also kind of limits where I can place them. They're not going to squeeze into as tight of an area as the smaller profile D-drum triggers. If you're interested in triggers and you're looking around at the different manufacturers and still not really liking what you see, you can always build your own. It's not that hard to do. It's not that expensive. And there's tons of tutorials out there showing you how to do it. A real common question about triggers is how exactly do they work? And the way they work is that they contain a small piezoelectric crystal. And a property of piezoelectric crystals is that they release electrons when they get squeezed, when they get compressed. So when you hit a drum and that sound wave is moving, right, the peak of that sound wave is going to come up and hit the sensor. And so that's going to cause that sensor to compress and release those electrons, which are going to flow down the cable to your sound module or your computer or whatever other device you might have receiving that signal. That equipment is going to respond by launching whatever event you've told it to do. Usually that's launching an audio sample. But most modules also convey MIDI information. So you can record the MIDI information and have a MIDI map of your playing, and you can go back in later and assign samples to the different strokes if you want to. You can even use the triggers in the module to control other MIDI instruments. You could hook it up to a synthesizer or a drum machine and access the sounds within that device that are MIDI compatible. So you could, literally play melodies and chords using your drums. Another thing you can do is turn that MIDI information into DMX lighting information and then use your triggers to control lighting and audio-visual effects. Color could be linked to the drum that you hit. Brightness could be linked to how hard you hit it. Literally any event from launching sound files to pyrotechnics could be controlled through triggers. Another kind of, less complicated application for live use of triggers is to use one to set up a noise gate to prevent false triggering caused by stage rumble. And so the way you can prevent that is that you set the sensitivity parameters on one trigger so that it generates a silent event, an empty event, when it gets activated by that stage rumble. And then you tell your module to reject any other signals from any other inputs if they're not above that particular level. Another trick you can do, which is more of a module trick than a trigger trick, what you can do is you can take a pre-recorded event like a hand clap or a big guitar chord, and you can send that track through the module just like you would, let's say you're like reamping a guitar. And so every time that hand clap hits or that guitar chord hits, the module is going to sense that event and then generate whatever you tell it to generate. So you could take that hand clap and turn it into a kick drum or a snare or, some other percussion. There's a lot you can really do with triggers if you want to get creative. The module that I use is the Alesis DM5, which debuted back in 1996. The DM5 underwent a firmware revision a few years later, and that's when I got into them, sort of that second generation. I have one DM5 on the big kit, and I have another DM5 for pretty much everything else. My favorite thing about the DM5 is that it has 12 analog 1/4-inch inputs. The back of the DM5 has those labeled as tom, kick, snare, cymbal, I think timbali, a go-go. But those are just default names. Every channel can access every bank and every sound. The one that I have set up to the big kit has 8 tom sounds, 1 kick sound, and 1 snare sound, which is activated by my side snare. Sometimes I use 2 triggers on the kick, and I set them to different sensitivities so that only one responds to a really hard hit. Okay, the other is going to kind of go, more naturally as I'm playing, but if I hit the drum really hard, another sound is going to enter. And so there are a couple of voices in the DM5 that cycle through multiple sounds, or they change in articulation based on the velocity of the hit. So that second trigger could be connected to one of those sounds that changes voices and kind of create more complex sounds in the percussion track as I play. I like to layer my triggered sounds with my mics and with other processing in order to create sort of a tuned reverb sound on the drums. And by switching through the electronic kits, I can change the sound and the character of the whole kit instantaneously. The DM5 allows you to save 21 kits, and I'm going to show you 9 of mine. There are going to be 4 variations of each one. First, you're going to hear just the triggered sound from the DM5, and then I'll start to dial in an external reverb that I like to use on the toms. I'm using an FX-1 set to a plate reverb, and you'll see me bring it in from like totally dry all the way up to 100% reverbed, and then I'll bring it back down to a more appropriate level. Next, I'll bring in the close mics that are mounted under each tom and on the kick. And then finally, I'll add in the overhead mics so you can hear the whole thing all together. And if I have everything set up right, all of those signals and those changes should go straight to my video camera, straight from the mixing board. One last thing, I want to point out that the kick drum runs on a separate signal path from the toms. The DM5 has 2 sets of stereo outputs. So I have the toms assigned to the main output group, and the kick drum is on the left channel of the aux output group. So that kick trigger, is not going to the reverb unit. You're just going to hear it relatively flat. It does get a little bit of treatment later on down the signal chain, but I'll talk more about that in the signal chain video segment later on, or maybe during the tour of the big kit. But for now, we're just really going to focus on the tom sounds. So the first set that I'll show you is my Hex Kit. It's based on the famous Hex drum sound from Simmons back in the 1980s, that cool electronic sound. The second and third kits I'll show you are the Omega Kit and the MakRak Kit. I'll show you a little bit more about how those kits are programmed, and then we'll listen to some more examples from another couple of categories of the electronic kits. So let's take a look at the Hex. All right, now with a little reverb. All right, so that's a max reverb. And now I'm going to dial that back a little bit and bring in those mics. All right, and lastly, we will bring in the overhead mics and the side snare mic. right, that was a taste of the Omega Kit. I decided to shoot this video in reverse. I put everything in here at the beginning so you could hear the sound mixed in with the live drums. And now I'm going to pull all the live drums back out, and we'll start with the sound dry, and then we'll bring in the reverb and the mics and all that stuff. As we get started here, the snare drum is set to stutter. The kick drum is set to a voice called Kinetica. And again, the toms here are on the Omega group. Okay, I've got everything dialed back. Let's hear the dry sound out of the module. All right, now I'll start bringing in the reverb. All right, and now the toms and the kick mic. And now I will bring in the overheads. Actually, you know what? Before I bring in the overheads, I want to show you one more thing that I didn't show you on the Hex. Since the tom group is assigned to the main outputs, and that's tied to the headphone jack, I can control how much of the tom mix is coming through by adjusting the headphone volume knob. Let me show you how that works real quick. Okay, so right now, you know, for the purposes of this demonstration, I've had the module set up pretty hot so you can really hear the triggers. But a lot of the time, you know, I dial it back a good bit. I don't have it as hot as it is here today. But, you know, that's another reason why I set up the groups the way that I did. So let me bring in the overheads now, and then again, you'll hear the whole kit. So this is what the kit's going to sound like without the triggers, except for the kick, obviously, because that's on a separate pathway. All right, that's a little taste of the MakRak Kit. I'll pull out the mics, and then we'll talk a little bit about how this kit is set up. All right, so the kick voice on this is set to a voice called Ragababble. It's in the random group, and it changes as I hit the drum. And then the side snare is also set to one of the voices out of the random group. This one's called The wave drum right now is set to voice number 84, and I've also got that running through the TC Electronic Nova delay. All right, let me pull the reverb down, and I'll show you what these voices sound like straight out of the module. I'm going to kill the delay here. I'm getting a little bit of that as an after effect. Now I'll bring in the close mics on the toms and the kick. And I'm also going to bring in the close mic on the side snare, but not the overheads yet. All right, and now the overheads, the whole kit will now be in the mix. All right, that's a look at the MakRak Kit. Let me reset everything. We'll talk a little bit more about the trigger settings, and then I'll come back and we'll listen to a couple more demonstrations. Okay, so you might have noticed that after the kit names, I have the letters HMLF. And if I scroll forward, you'll see other kits labeled HML and HL. What that indicates is if the kit is based on drum sounds that have a high, mid, low, and floor tom, or just a high, mid, and low, or just a high and low. Here in the toms group of the sound chart, we have the hero voice. And you can see that it has high, mid, low, and floor options. But the open voice just below it only has high, mid, and low. And a little further down, we have the big O sound, which only has a high and a low. Since I have 8 toms, I have to use each voice between 2 and 4 times. The first thing that I did when I programmed these kits was to organize them into these 3 categories. I ended up with 7 HMLF kits, high, mid, low, floor, 9 HML kits, high, mid, low, and 7 HL kits, just high and low. And that comes out to a total of 23 kits. Since I only get to save 21, 2 of the high-low kits are not saved. But if I want to access them, all I have to do is go into the last kit, number 20, and there I can change the voices that I'm using. I'll just leave all the other settings the same. So you can see here on that last kit, number 20, it's named Girth Oil Bit. Because it could be the girth kit, the oil kit, or the bit kit. So let's hear a few examples from this high, mid, low group. The first is going to be the Studio. The second is the CanFlng. And the third is called Bombtom. All right, that was the Studio Tom sound. The kick I have on that is this 909. I do not have the side snare on this kit right now. I had to pull it off because it was cross-talking with the 10-inch tom. I did obviously have some reverb in that mix. I'm going to pull the reverb out. One of the things I really like about the studio sound is how I think that it plays really nicely with reverb. It's got a little bit of reverb built into the sound, so it really just brings out the reverb that's there by adding more. All right, now I'll bring in the tom mics and the kick mic. All right, and now with the overheads and the full kit. All right, that's a little taste of the CanFlng Kit. That's just straight up out of the module. I'll start adding in some reverb to that. And the kick I have on that is Kinetica. That's one of my favorite kicks. So I'm going to dial back that reverb there and bring in the tom mics and the kick mic and the side snare mic, and then we'll bring in the overheads. All right, now we'll bring in the overhead mics and the side snare mic. All right, so that's a taste of the CanFlng. I'm going to reset, and then we'll take a look at the Bombtom set. All right, that's a little bit of the Bombtom. The kick on this is the Forum voice, and I'll start bringing in the reverb now. And now I'll bring in the close tom mics and the kick mic. All right, and now the full kit with the overheads. All right, so that's the Bombtom. We'll reset, talk a little bit more about the trigger settings, and then I'll show you some of the high-low kits. Okay, so once I had the toms organized into these three groups, I made a template, starting with the HMLF group. First, I set the parameters that are universal across the kits, such as the trigger gain, the trigger sensitivities, crosstalk, decay, all that stuff. And all of that's mostly controlled in the external trigger area of the DM5. Then I went into the mix area, and I panned each trigger to mirror the placement of the mics and the placement of the toms on the kit. I created separation wherever I had to use the same sound more than once by using the tune screen. And finally, I set the output groups and the volume in the mix area. I saved that template to all 21 locations, and then I went into each one, changed the voices, and then named the kit to match the name of the tom group. So before we get into the last group, the high-lows, I want to quickly show you the template and explain a little bit more about some of the parameters and settings. I've also made this template available in a Google Drive folder, along with copies of the completed sheets for all 21 of my e-kits. And you can find that down in the link in the description below. So on the far left, I have the trigger number, what the input is called on the back of the DM5, and what acoustic drum it represents. The group column here says multi. And what that means is that every voice assigned to that group will go through its entire decay, even if another trigger in the same group gets activated. So a drum will not get its tail chopped off when I hit another drum. I chose that option because that's how drums behave acoustically. If you want the sound to cut out as soon as you hit another drum, you can change that in the group setting. The grouping really comes into play more with instruments like hi-hats, where you have an open and a closed sound kind of happening together and interacting with each other, or with something like a tambourine, where each hit is going to choke the previous hit. But that's not really something I have to deal with since I'm mostly just using tom sounds. Next up, we have the number, the name, and the MIDI note of the sound. I'm also not going to get into the MIDI stuff right now, but if you wanted to, you could spend weeks exploring all the MIDI functions. Next up, we have the gain, velocity, crosstalk, decay, and noise floor. Those are all the sensitivity controls for each trigger, and they also regulate how the triggers behave and interact as a group. Lastly, we have the tuning, volume, panning, and output pathway. As for the tuning, you might think that being limited to just 2, 3, or even 4 voices would be problematic for a kit with 8 toms. But you can tune each voice up by 300 cents or 3 semitones, or you can tune it down by 400 cents or 4 semitones. So even if I have the same voice assigned to multiple drums, I still have quite a bit of range. So, if a voice is normally defaulted to like the note of C, you could really tune it anywhere from an A flat to a D sharp. And since the triggers are blended into my mic sound, it's not really an issue. The triggers are just adding a little character, a little reverb, a little presence. For the panning, you have mono, left and right, and 1, 2, and 3 to determine how hard that pan is. A pan of R1 means slightly right, while a pan of L3 would mean hard left. As I mentioned earlier, there are 2 output pathways, main and aux. The main pathway also feeds the headphone jack, so if you have sounds assigned to the aux group and you're monitoring through headphones, you're not going to hear those sounds. But you can use this 4-track output system in conjunction with the grouping feature to separate groups for additional processing or monitoring. Like if you had some that are set to that multi and they're going to ring out entirely, and you have others set as individual, they're going to cut off. So you can separate with grouping and sending to the different output paths if you want to apply additional processing or to monitor in a different way. And in a pinch, you can even use the headphone jack as another main out pathway. So you can see that I have all the triggers and the side snare trigger assigned to the main group. And so those are going to the FX-1 processor for that additional reverb. But again, the kick is separate. That's going to the aux group, pan hard left. So that's my template. Let's switch gears one last time and close this out with 3 kits from the high-low group. Again, since it's just high-low, it's only going to be 2 voices, but I've got those 2 voices tuned across 4 drums each using that tune range. So these are going to be the noise kit, the big O, and the jazz. Thanks for checking out. I hope you learned a little bit about triggers, and I'll see you in the next segment. All right, that's just the noise kit. No mics are in that little introduction there. The kick I have on this is called Shake and Bake. This is another one of these voices that is from the random group. It will change as you play it. So I'll hit it a couple times here, and you can hear what that's all about. The snare drum is set to one of the effect voices called Tank Hit. All right, let's start to bring in that reverb. All right, that sounds pretty good. And now I'll bring in the close tom mics and the kick mic and the side snare mic. And then lastly, I'll bring in the overheads. All right, now the overheads. All right, stick around. The big O will be up next. All right, that's a little bit of the Big O voice. The kick that I have on this kit right now is the Fusion Sound, and the side snare, which I don't think I used, is set on the Black Beauty. So let me kill my talkback mic here, and you can hear what those sound like. All right, and now I will pull out the reverb and the mics. We'll hear the Big O voice from the toms straight out of the module, and then I'll start bringing that stuff back in. All right, here's the Big O toms, dry, no reverb. Now I'll start bringing in that reverb. All right, now with the close tom, kick, and snare mics. All right, now back with the overheads in and the full kit. All right, that's a little bit of the jazz voice. The kick I have on this right now is set to a voice called Big One, and the side snare, which, again, I don't think I played, is set to a voice called Hawaii. So I'll pull out the mics and the reverb. We'll hear the jazz voice by itself out of the module. I'll bring all that stuff in. You know the drill. Toms, overheads. All right, so this will be the jazz voice straight out of the module. No toms, no reverb. All right, now with some reverb added. All right, now with the microphones punched in. All right, now I'll bring in the overhead mics. All right, that's the jazz. Thanks for sticking around. I'll see you in the next segment.